Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Haven, your place for peaceful rest and calm nights. Allow the rain sounds to gently guide you into a tranquil state, and let me share with you a story that has been passed down for generations. This is the story of the lost cabin in the woods. It all began over 2 centuries ago, in the early 1800s, when the land we now call the American West was still wild, untamed, and full of mysteries waiting to be discovered. The story follows a man named Samuel. Samuel was a prospector, someone who had spent years chasing the dream of striking it rich, of finding that elusive vein of gold that would change his life forever. But the road was long, and the journey harder than he had ever imagined. Samuel had been traveling for days, moving deeper into the wilderness, driven by the hope of discovering something extraordinary. The land seemed endless, filled with rough terrain and dense forests. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wet foliage. Samuel could feel the weight of the journey in his bones, and the solitude of the wild weighed heavily on his heart. Though he had encountered many hardships on the road, this time felt different. Something was changing in him. He was no longer just a man searching for gold. He was seeking something more profound, something intangible. One cold and rainy afternoon, after several weeks of travel, Samuel found himself deep in the wilderness, far from any settlement or familiar road. The skies above were heavy with clouds, and the rain fell in sheets, drenching everything in sight. His clothes were soaked, his provisions were nearly gone, and he was beginning to wonder if he would ever find what he was looking for. As he trudged through the mud, the sound of the rain echoed in his ears. The world around him was a blur of wet trees and rushing streams, the earth soft beneath his boots. He thought about stopping to rest, but he couldn't bring himself to. Something inside told him he had to keep going, so he walked. But just as he was about to give in to exhaustion, something unusual happened. He saw a flicker of light through the trees, a soft, warm glow in the distance. Samuel stopped in his tracks. Was he imagining it? Had the storm played tricks on him? He couldn't say, but the light was real enough to make him curious. He knew he had to investigate. With renewed strength, Samuel followed the light through the dense forest, the sound of the rain growing softer as the trees thickened. The further he went, the more certain he became that he was headed towards something special. The light grew brighter, and soon he was standing in front of a small clearing. And there it was. The cabin stood before him, nestled perfectly among the trees. The logs were weathered but sturdy, and the windows glowed with a warm, inviting light. Samuel couldn't believe his eyes. Here, in the middle of nowhere, was a home, a safe haven in the midst of the storm. He approached cautiously, wondering who could possibly live so far out in these wild woods. With a knock on the door, his heart pounded in his chest. The door creaked open, and there stood a woman. She was tall, with dark flowing hair and an air of quiet strength about her. Her eyes met his, and without a word, she stepped aside to let him in. "Come in," she said softly, her voice like the gentle crackle of a fire. "You're wet, and the storm is only getting worse." Samuel didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, and immediately he was enveloped in warmth. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow across the room. The scent of pine wood mixed with the fresh, earthy aroma of the rain. It was the kind of warmth that went beyond the fire. It felt like a deep comfort, a sense of being home. The woman introduced herself as Miriam. She was the only one who lived in the cabin, she explained. Her family had once lived there too, many years ago, but they had long since passed. Still, the cabin remained, a quiet refuge for those who might stumble upon it. "Sit by the fire," Miriam urged, gesturing to a chair near the hearth. "You must be hungry." Samuel nodded gratefully, sitting down and removing his boots, his feet aching from the long journey. Miriam moved about the cabin with quiet grace, preparing a meal from simple ingredients she had gathered in the surrounding forest. She didn't speak much, but her presence was calming, almost as if she could read Samuel's mind and knew exactly what he needed. As they ate, Samuel tried to learn more about the woman who lived in this secluded cabin. He asked her about the area, about the land, about how she had ended up here all alone. Miriam smiled, a distant look in her eyes as she spoke of her ancestors, of a family that had once thrived here, living off the land and passing down stories that stretched back for generations. But as the conversation went on, Samuel began to sense something unusual. Miriam's words seemed to float in the air as though they belonged to a different time. She spoke of things long past, of events that had happened decades ago, as if they had happened only yesterday. And then the strangest thing happened. As the evening wore on and the fire began to dim, Samuel noticed that Miriam hadn't aged a day. Her skin was smooth, her hair still dark and vibrant, as though she had never seen a day over 25. And yet, she spoke as if she had lived through a century. Samuel was intrigued but cautious. He decided to ask her, gently, how old she was. Miriam's eyes flickered, and for a moment, there was a strange, unspoken tension in the room. "I've lived here a long time," she said softly. "Longer than most would believe. Time moves differently in these woods." Samuel was about to ask what she meant when he suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion wash over him. The long journey, the rain, the warmth of the fire, it all made him feel drowsy, like he had never felt before. "Perhaps you should rest," Miriam suggested. "There is a bed in the other room. You'll sleep well here. There's no rush to leave." Samuel, feeling an unexplainable calm, agreed. He let Miriam lead him to the small bedroom in the back of the cabin. The bed was made with thick quilts and soft, worn sheets. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood, and the rain continued to tap lightly against the roof, creating a soothing rhythm. As he lay in the bed, the fire's embers glowing softly through the door, Samuel closed his eyes. The gentle, steady sound of the rain outside, the quiet hum of the wind through the trees, and the warmth of the room surrounded him. He felt safe, at peace, as though the world outside the cabin no longer existed. But even as his body began to drift towards sleep, something nagged at the back of his mind. There was something about the cabin, about Miriam, that didn't quite make sense. But the comfort of the moment was too powerful to ignore. His thoughts faded, and soon he was asleep. Several hours passed. When Samuel awoke, it was still dark outside. The fire had burned low, and the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with silence. He sat up in bed, feeling a strange unease. Something wasn't right. He got out of bed and made his way to the front of the cabin, but when he reached the door, the world outside was no longer the same. The clearing was gone. Instead, there was only thick forest, with trees stretching endlessly into the night. The cabin was nowhere to be seen. He stepped outside, his heart racing. The rain had stopped, but the woods felt more ominous now, like they were hiding something. Samuel searched the area frantically, but there was nothing. The cabin had disappeared, vanished into thin air. All that remained was the haunting memory of a woman, a place of warmth and safety, and the sensation that he had been part of something otherworldly, something beyond time itself. As dawn began to break, Samuel made his way back through the woods, confused and unsettled. The path seemed familiar, yet foreign. He couldn't explain it, but the memory of Miriam and the cabin stayed with him. He returned to the town near the edge of the forest, but no one seemed to remember the cabin, nor could they direct him to its location. Was it a dream? Had it been real? Samuel didn't know. He couldn't let go of the feeling that Miriam and her cabin were still out there, waiting. And so, year after year, he ventured back into those woods, always searching, never finding. Sometimes, in his dreams, he would find it again, the cabin glowing softly in the rain, Miriam standing at the door, beckoning him to come inside. But when he awoke, he would find himself lying in his bed, alone. Some say it's a legend, a tale told by those who wander too deep into the forest. Others believe the cabin only appears to those who need it the most. And so, the legend of the lost cabin in the woods persists, whispered among travelers and settlers alike. It's said that if you find yourself lost, the cabin will appear, but once you leave, it will be gone forever. The rain falls gently now, a reminder of that place, that time when the world felt suspended in a dream. Feel the rain now, softly, steadily falling. The rhythm is familiar, the world is quiet. You are safe, you are warm. Sleep now, as the lost cabin rests somewhere out there, waiting for the next traveler in need of its refuge. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.